Since the times of the Old Testament, God instructs us to care for the needy, whether through tithing or by leaving part of the harvest for the poor. However, in a modern world focused on individualism and wealth accumulation, these teachings seem increasingly distant. As there is little material on this topic online, it's worth watching this video until the end because it will be very enlightening. This is a short video where you will understand how the lessons about charity and generosity present in the Old Testament are still relevant and how we can apply these guidelines to live more aligned with divine principles. If you're interested in this topic, welcome. Go ahead and give this video a like. It's free and helps us keep creating more content for you. While you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. Now let's dive right in. Have you ever wondered why, despite the clear biblical mandate to give, so many choose to ignore it? It's a question that forces us to reflect on how much society has strayed from these ancient teachings. In the Old Testament, charity is not just encouraged, it is commanded. The people of Israel were given specific instructions on how to care for the less fortunate, from tithing to leaving portions of their harvest for the poor. Yet, today, these practices have been largely forgotten, or worse, ignored. One of the most significant commandments relating to charity comes from the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 15 verses 7 to 11, we find a clear call to open our hands to the poor and to not harden our hearts against them. This isn't a gentle suggestion, it's a commandment that calls for action. The Israelites were expected to take these laws seriously, but over time, this focus on generosity began to wane, especially as societies became more individualistic and wealth-oriented. Another reason why these teachings are overlooked is the modern emphasis on personal achievement. In today's culture, success is often measured by individual wealth accumulation, not by how much we give away. This mindset is in stark contrast to the teachings of the Old Testament, which emphasize that our resources are meant to be shared. When viewed through the lens of biblical wisdom, we see that our wealth is not just for personal use, but also for the betterment of others. Furthermore, there's an interesting psychological component at play. Many people avoid charity because of a fear of scarcity, a belief that if they give away too much, they'll be left with too little. However, the Bible teaches the opposite. Proverbs 11 verses 24 to 25 tells us that one person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. This counterintuitive principle shows that generosity is, in fact, the path to true abundance. But why do so many ignore these powerful lessons? Part of the problem lies in the disconnect between ancient texts and modern life. People often see the Old Testament as outdated or irrelevant, not realizing that its teachings on charity are timeless and just as applicable today. The idea of giving sacrificially has been replaced with a more transactional approach to generosity, one where people only give when they expect something in return. Lastly, we must consider the social structures that have evolved over time. In biblical times, communities were smaller, and people were more directly responsible for one another. Today, with the rise of government programs and institutionalized aid, many individuals feel less personal responsibility to help those in need. This shift has further contributed to the widespread neglect of biblical charity. The reasons why many ignore the Old Testament's teachings on charity are complex, but they all point back to a fundamental misalignment with biblical principles. By revisiting these forgotten commandments, we can begin to reclaim a deeper, more meaningful approach to generosity. If the Bible clearly outlines the importance of generosity, then why do so few people feel the weight of that responsibility today? In the Old Testament, wealth is depicted not as a personal achievement, but as a resource entrusted to individuals by God to benefit the broader community. This shift in perspective is crucial, but often lost in the hustle of modern-day capitalism. So, what does it mean to be generous according to biblical standards? A key text that highlights this responsibility comes from Deuteronomy 24 verses 19 to 21, where the Israelites are commanded to leave the edges of their fields unharvested so that the poor and the foreigner may gather food. This isn't just an act of charity. It's a reflection of a community-oriented economy where resources were viewed as blessings to be shared. Today, such practices would seem radical, but in biblical times, they were considered essential for the survival of society's most vulnerable members. In addition, Proverbs 19 verse 17 makes an incredible statement. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. This verse underscores that acts of charity are not just moral obligations, but are seen as direct investments in divine justice. By neglecting the call to generosity, people miss out on both spiritual and practical rewards that come from helping others. Interestingly, the concept of tithing, giving 1/10 of one's income to support religious or social causes, originates in the Old Testament as well. This practice isn't just about giving money to the church. It's about cultivating a heart of generosity and a willingness to share. Today, tithing is often seen as optional or symbolic, but in the biblical context, it was a non-negotiable act of faith and responsibility toward the community. One of the reasons this responsibility is overlooked is the prevailing cultural belief in self-sufficiency. In ancient Israel, individuals were deeply connected to their communities, and their success was measured by how well they supported others. In contrast, modern societies place a premium on independence and personal success, which can diminish the sense of obligation to care for those who have less. Furthermore, it's worth noting how Deuteronomy and Proverbs frequently connect generosity to social justice. This isn't just about giving for the sake of giving. It's about creating a more just and equitable society. The poor, the orphan, and the foreigner are repeatedly mentioned as groups deserving special care. Ignoring this responsibility leads to social decay, while embracing it strengthens the bonds that hold communities together. But the question remains, why do so few people respond to this call? One reason is the pervasive myth that personal wealth and success are entirely self-made, ignoring the biblical principle that all resources ultimately come from God. When individuals see their wealth as solely their own, the desire to share diminishes. However, recognizing that our resources are blessings from God intended to uplift others can reignite the call to be generous. How would society look today if we truly embraced the radical idea of the Jubilee? This concept, detailed in the book of Leviticus, commanded that every 50 years, debts were to be forgiven, land was to be returned to its original owners, and economic balances were reset. It's a concept that might sound idealistic in the modern world, but it was once a foundational principle in biblical law. The Jubilee was a strikingly forward-thinking solution to economic inequality, yet many have never even heard of it. Why did such a bold vision for justice fade into obscurity? The Jubilee was more than just an economic policy. It was a divine mandate meant to prevent the accumulation of generational wealth and the entrenchment of poverty. In Leviticus 25 verses 10 to 13, God commands that the land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine and you are but aliens and my tenants. This redistribution of wealth every half-century was meant to ensure that no one would remain permanently impoverished or overly wealthy, and it was a profound way of maintaining balance in society. Imagine the impact if something like this were instituted today. But the practical implications of Jubilee were far-reaching. It wasn't just about land and wealth. It was about restoring dignity to the disenfranchised. People who had lost their homes or were enslaved due to debt would have their freedom restored. The year of Jubilee was a fresh start for everyone, a moment of divine reset that ensured the well-being of future generations. This wasn't merely a financial exercise. It was a statement about the inherent value of every person in the eyes of God. One of the most striking aspects of Jubilee is its focus on social justice. In modern societies, wealth often accumulates in the hands of a few, leading to vast economic disparities. The Jubilee addressed this by redistributing resources, ensuring that no one was left permanently destitute. It was a clear message from God. Society was to be structured in a way that cared for all its members. This biblical command is a direct challenge to modern capitalism, where the gap between rich and poor continues to widen. So, why was such a revolutionary practice abandoned? Over time, as Israel became more politically and economically complex, the Jubilee may have been seen as too difficult to enforce. Furthermore, those in positions of power and wealth had little incentive to support a system that threatened their accumulated resources. This reflects a larger, ongoing issue: the reluctance of the wealthy to share their resources, even when commanded by divine law. Additionally, we must consider how the Jubilee ties into broader themes of justice and compassion found throughout the Old Testament. The Jubilee wasn't just an economic tool. It was a spiritual practice. It was a recognition that all resources ultimately belong to God, and humans are merely stewards of His creation. This understanding could radically alter how modern society views wealth and property. Today, the idea of a Jubilee remains largely symbolic, but its lessons are more relevant than ever. As we face growing inequality and economic instability, the biblical principle of resetting wealth and offering second chances could offer a framework for justice and fairness. Perhaps it's time we re-examine these ancient practices and consider how they might inspire modern solutions to economic disparity. The Jubilee was God's bold plan for social justice, ensuring that wealth never became concentrated in the hands of a few and that all had a chance to start anew. While the practice faded from history, its principles remain a powerful call to action for us today. If the principles of charity and compassion in Deuteronomy are timeless, why do they feel so distant from our modern experience? The book of Deuteronomy, particularly in chapters 15 and 24, emphasizes the importance of taking care of the poor and disadvantaged, not just as an act of kindness, but as a divine obligation. This section will explore how these lessons from the past can still guide us today, especially in a world that is often driven by self-interest rather than compassion. Deuteronomy 15 verses 7 to 11 provides a clear directive. If there is among you a poor man of your brethren, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your poor brother. This command is not merely a suggestion. It's an order from God to open our hearts and hands. But why, in a world overflowing with wealth, do we still struggle to meet this standard? Perhaps the answer lies in our tendency to disconnect from the struggles of others. In the biblical world, the community was closely knit and poverty was visible. Today, many live in bubbles of comfort, unaware or unmoved by the plight of the less fortunate. The book of Deuteronomy doesn't just call for charity. It connects giving directly to blessings from God. In Deuteronomy 15 verse 10, it says, "Give generously to them and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to." This promise of blessing is powerful, but it also highlights a principle often overlooked. True generosity doesn't come from a place of duty or obligation, but from a heart that understands the interconnectedness of human beings. The Bible also ties charity to the idea of social justice. Deuteronomy 24 verses 19 to 22 commands that the harvest should not be entirely reaped. Instead, the forgotten sheaf should be left for the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. This directive ensures that those who are marginalized are not left behind. While modern societies have welfare systems and aid programs, the personal, direct involvement commanded in Deuteronomy offers a different model. One where charity is not outsourced to institutions, but is instead a daily practice of compassion. Another fascinating aspect of these laws is the element of compassionate debt forgiveness. In Deuteronomy, 15 verses 1 to 2, it's written that every 7 years, debts should be forgiven, giving people a chance to start fresh. Imagine if modern economies adopted a similar practice. The biblical directive wasn't just about financial fairness, but was a recognition that mercy must be extended in all areas of life, allowing people to recover from setbacks without being crushed by the weight of debt. Why then have these practices been so difficult to maintain in modern societies? Part of the challenge lies in the shift from a community-centered society to one that emphasizes individual achievement. In biblical times, the survival of the group depended on mutual aid and support. Today, the focus on personal success often comes at the expense of communal well-being, which makes the biblical call to charity and compassion seem more radical than it should. Yet the lessons from Deuteronomy are as relevant now as ever. As the gap between rich and poor widens globally, the need for personal, compassionate charity becomes clearer. The idea that those with resources have an obligation to care for the less fortunate is not just a religious or moral duty. It's a principle of justice that ensures the stability of society as a whole. The lessons from Deuteronomy remind us that charity and compassion are timeless values, crucial for the well-being of society. By reconnecting with these ancient teachings, we can find new ways to engage in meaningful acts of kindness and justice in our modern world. As we've explored throughout this video, the biblical teachings on charity, generosity, and justice are not just relics of the past. They hold profound relevance for our world today. From the forgotten commandments on giving to the radical concept of Jubilee and the timeless call for compassion found in Deuteronomy, these ancient lessons offer solutions to some of our most pressing modern challenges. But the real question is, will we choose to embrace them? Reflect on this. Generosity is more than an act. It's a reflection of our values and the world we want to build. In a time where inequality continues to rise, these biblical principles remind us that true wealth is measured by how much we give, not how much we keep. So, what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? If this content touched you positively, leaving a like is the best way to express your gratitude and encourage us to produce more content like this. I also invite you to share the greatest lesson you learned from this video. Leave a comment with your reflection or something that touched you in a special way. I would feel very honored and happy to know how this message impacted your life. See you in the next video.